Hi, I'm Maggie.
And I'm Marin, and you're listening to Tell Me I'm Sorry, a podcast where we deconstruct and muse on depictions of girlhood in film, literature, and other media.
A feminist celebration of pop culture, the audacity of youth, and the ways we grow away from and into our bodies, beliefs, and dreams for ourselves and each other.
And today we are discussing
Nancy Drew.
You almost sounded confused.
Because for a second I was afraid, like, oh, was there a colon? Like, was it?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I was thinking about the books.
The books, yeah.
Sorry.
That's a good point. Nancy Drew, directed by Andrew Fleming, who has directed some other films I suspect we might discuss on this podcast.
Okay.
Such as The Craft.
Really?
Yes.
What?
And the film Dick, which I have not seen and I have been meaning to watch for years. And it's of particular interest, I think, to this podcast because it's like 90s starring the love of my life, Michelle Williams, and the love of your life, Kirsten Dunst. Yeah.
Oh, wait. I know that. I've definitely, it's been so long that I've seen it. It would be like watching it again for the first time. Anyway, okay, go on.
Yes. So, more recently, he's transitioned into TV a lot more. Probably the biggest thing he's directed is Emily in Paris, which I haven't watched, but I know people feel a certain way about it. He's directed 16 episodes of that. Written by Andrew Fleming, Tiffany Paulson, who has also weirdly written 2 other romantic comedies. Not that Nancy Drew is a romantic comedy. That Emma Roberts has been in. The Holiday and About Fate, which I think were both Netflix originals. Haven't seen either of them, but I'm pretty sure in The Holiday she poops her pants.
I like lightly watched
an
that
adult
one.
movie though, but she poops her pants at some point.
I don't remember that, but however, when I'm watching the Holiday movie, I'm half watching it.
Yeah.
You know? So I must have missed the part. That was probably the best part of the movie.
Probably.
Sorry, that was rude.
No.
It wasn't very good, to be fair. It's a holiday movie. I wasn't watching it for, cinematic genius.
I'm pretty sure it got really bad reviews.
It was bad.
If I remember
It's
right.
pretty bad.
I don't know the last time Emma Roberts was in a good movie. And then finally, the third person to have a writing credit on this Nancy Drew adaptation is Mildred Wirt Benson, aka the first Carolyn Keene. This film, Nancy Drew, is based on the book series Nancy Drew, which you've probably heard of. And all the books are credited to a woman named Carolyn Keene, which is actually a pseudonym for a large group of women. Multiple women over the course of history have written the Nancy Drew books. Mildred Wirt Benson was the very first one, so she has a writing credit on this movie, even though she died in 2002. This film was released June 15th, 2007, and the poster tagline is "Small Town Girl, Big Time Adventure," which I can't read without sounding like an asshole. Because I think it's such a stupid tagline.
It's bad.
It's really bad.
It also doesn't seem right.
No.
Sleuthing is different than adventure.
Yeah.
Adventure implies that what is happening to this character is coming at them. It implies that they have less control over their environment.
Yeah.
Not that she necessarily has control over her environment, but I think she has more control over it than going on an adventure. She's making a choice.
She is making a choice to sleuth. The term adventure also implies a lightness that I don't know is present in this movie. Because ultimately, this is a movie about a teenage girl solving a murder, and as a result of that, multiple men trying to kill her.
Yeah.
Not to be a party pooper about it, but I'm like, this is a wild tagline. Okay, Maggie, if I were to Google Nancy Drew 2007, what would Google tell me this movie is about?
Oh, let me share. According to Google, amateur sleuth Nancy Drew accompanies her father on a business trip to Los Angeles and stumbles across evidence in the case of a movie star's long unsolved death. The young heroine's resourcefulness and integrity are put to the test in the glamorous, but sometimes treacherous, world of Hollywood.
See, I knew you would read that so much more theatrically than I could. That's why that's going to be your official job now. Okay. You're just so much better at it. Now, for what I have called the Marin synopsis, yes. Which is where I... Thank you, Maggie. Which is where I just fill in the gaps of the plot, so that way we don't have to contextualize stuff as much when we're getting into the discussion. So, spoilers ahead. Nancy, played by Emma Roberts, and her dad... They are temporarily relocating to Los Angeles for his job, and he tells her that she's not allowed to sleuth while living in LA because it is a much more dangerous place than their small town of River Heights, Illinois. However, Nancy wants to solve the murder of a woman named Delia Draycott, who was a huge movie star in the 80s, went incognito for a few months, no one knew where she was, and then soon after she resurfaced, she was murdered. And Nancy and her dad, they move into Delia's house, which Nancy picked because there's big mystery there. Nancy tries not to sleuth, but she keeps finding clues, and she can't stop sleuthing. And while this is all happening, she struggles to fit into her new school. She's bullied by two girls in particular. She befriends a 12-year-old boy who I think is actually a demon. His name is Corky. And this weird rivalry develops between Corky and Ned, who is Nancy's kind of boyfriend from back home in River Heights. When Ned visits LA, there's a lot of tension between these two boys. It's very weird. And these two boys help her sleuth. Nancy uncovers that Delia was pregnant not long before she died and had put her daughter up for adoption. She finds Delia's daughter, who's played by Rachel Lee Cook. Hi, Rachel Lee Cook. I love you. And she sets out to find Delia's missing will. And she eventually figures out, after being harassed, threatened, and kidnapped by various men, that Delia was murdered by her manager/lawyer, a man named Dashiell Biedermeier. And when Nancy's dad finds out about her sleuthing, he tells her he's proud of her because she was helping people. They return to River Heights, Ned and Nancy kiss, and we presume Nancy will continue solving cases which cannot be solved by inept law enforcement agencies.
That's fair.
I realize that sounded very convoluted, but there's a lot of moving parts in this movie.
I understood it, but I also watched the movie. But, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. For me, the most jarring aspect of all of this is the fact that Nancy Drew is in middle school, right? Or is she in high school?
She's in high school. She can drive.
Oh, okay. Well, in South Dakota, you can start driving at 14.
That's true. Yeah, I remember my dad got his farmer's permit when he grew up in rural Nebraska. Permit, not farmer's permit.
I know what you meant. Okay, but she is so young.
She is really young. She's 16, I would say.
She is, yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. But
Corky is in high school, but he is 12.
Okay, so this is probably where my confusion came from.
Yeah.
Trying to sort
because
out.
Like, there's a scene after they meet where he tells her that he's 12 or something, and she's like, were you in high school because you were advanced academically? So you skipped grades? And he's like, no, there just wasn't enough action in middle school. And when I'm saying it and laughing about it, it's not because I think it's actually funny. It's just so stupid.
What I learned very quickly in this movie is that I really had to suspend disbelief. But it's a movie for children.
Yes. So this movie is rated PG. This is a movie that is made for 10-year-old girls. Mm-hmm. So we are way above that threshold. It does make for a strange experience as an adult where it's like, no shit, the like jilted lawyer murdered the actress who didn't want to act anymore. Why the fuck was no one questioning this man? Mm-hmm. He's obvious suspect number one. But it took 30 years and Nancy Drew's sleuthing skills to figure it out. Because that's just what we needed in order for the movie to exist.
But also, it kind of adds up. As far as who cares about dead women.
That's true.
Other women. Not an entirely male police force, which I believe it was in this movie.
We never saw a female cop ever.
Yeah.
So, Nancy Drew came out summer 2007. I believe it was the summer between my second and third grade. And I had read some of the Nancy Drew books. I couldn't tell you which ones. And I remember liking them, but I wasn't super obsessed with them. None of them stand out to me now. I couldn't tell you what happens in any of them.
Same.
Which maybe they're written to be that way. I don't know. But I remember my mom taking me to see this movie at the second run theater where tickets were like $2. And I was just obsessed with it. This was the first movie that I saw multiple times in the theater. I saw this movie 3 times in the theaters. My mother watched this movie 3 times in the theaters because I was so obsessed with it. I'm just like, wow, my mom must have really loved me for her to do that. And I had it on DVD. The DVD is still somewhere at my parents' house. My dad bought me the soundtrack on CD, and I have very vivid memories of doing my Saturday morning chores and putting the CD in my parents' CD player and blasting it while I was like sweeping the house, thinking I was like so cool. And yeah, I really loved this movie. I couldn't tell you how many times I have seen this movie, but so I watched it again a couple weeks ago for this podcast. The last time I watched it was in spring of 2020 when I was quarantining in my parents' house at the start of COVID, and my mom and I watched it because it was nostalgia. And I don't remember what I felt watching it then, but watching it now, I think it's safe to say most of the affection that I had for it is not there anymore. And that's all I'm going to say right now about that.
Okay. My own origin story is that I watched this movie for this podcast, did not know this movie existed. As I'm watching this, because I don't have any nostalgia, I was watching it, imagining why Marin has this nostalgia and also why little Marin would have loved this movie. Gosh. And I'm going to be honest,
analyze me.
It made so much sense.
Oh God. Okay.
From the get-go.
We need to get into this.
In part, not the plot necessarily, right, but her character. She's so organized. She's so...
I wanted that sleuthing kit so bad.
It makes sense. It's adding up. How straightforward she is, but she's able to articulate her thoughts at a higher order of thinking that I'll never really be able to match. And that is something that you do. But
I don't know about that.
It's true. But even down to her outfits.
I do think her outfits are still... They're great.
No, they're good. And every outfit she came out in, I was like, I could see Marin wearing that right now, honestly. I think that everything about it. The characterization of Nancy Drew, I can totally see why young Marin loved this movie.
I do think this tracks. She's very smart and she's very capable, and those were definitely things I aspired to be when I was young. And she's very put together.
Yeah.
In a way that I think when I was a kid, I was like, oh my God, she's so cool. And now as an adult, I'm almost a little frustrated by how put together she is.
I can understand that. But a kid you isn't thinking about...
Right. And so that's why there's part of me that's really curious about how this whole conversation is going to go, because it's how valuable are my adult analyses of this movie made for a kid? You know what I mean? Is there a point where I'm just overdoing it in applying a certain... Because I'm not saying that, you know, children don't deserve like high quality media. They do. And we should want the art made for children to be held to a high standard too.
I think that watching this, I also thought about how much I hope that the media that we were making for children is better, because watching this, what do I notice? The complete lack of diversity, race or ethnicity, or also just socioeconomic status. Her and her lawyer dad are just going to Los Angeles for a while and rent out a mansion, and then it's just like, okay.
But it's like weirdly implied by the realtor that like the mansion is one of the cheaper things they could have, because she's like, well, we don't have anything else in your price range. And I was very confused by the class dynamics in this movie, because they also have a housekeeper, which is, I think, just a nod at the books, because she's more of a figure in the books. She has one scene in the movie. So it's a household of 2 people and they have a housekeeper. But then Nancy's dad makes some reference like, well, we don't have that much money. And I'm like, what? Nancy's like, we have enough money, Dad. And he's like, I'll be the judge of that. And I'm like, But you can afford a live-in housekeeper, it seems.
Well,
It's very confusing.
and as soon as they wipe away the cobwebs, it's a beautiful mansion. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfect.
I'm like, oh, who wouldn't want to be living in this dope house where this dead movie star lived? It's America. We're obsessed with true crime.
Those are most of my thoughts. I could
yeah.
understand why a young Marin, knowing adult Marin, right? Young Marin doesn't have the same political and philosophical filter as adult Marin. And I think that's good. Kids should be allowed to be kids. But yeah, this movie very much reflects a world in which everybody just gets to have fun all the time and no one has to worry about bills or...
Well, my first sort of question I have, which is kind of vague, but what do you think of Nancy's characterization?
Okay.
Because I have a whole little paragraph of notes, but I want to hear what you think first.
All right. The first thing I wrote down was, why does she have to tell these grown men to go to therapy? Already, I was enraged that it was somehow the responsibility of this adolescent teenage girl to tell these grown men that in order to stop doing crime, they should figure out how to deal with their feelings.
Yeah.
So instantly I was like, I feel she is in some ways expected to be put together at a level of adultness that she should not even have to worry about.
Yeah.
And that made me think that's actually such a realistic representation of the expectations we have for young women.
Yeah.
That they are responsible for men's behavior starting right out, right? Oh, girls are more mature than boys. Really? No, the world just expects us to be more mature so that men's behavior can be excused.
That's a note I had. Within the first 5 minutes of this movie, it opens with her solving a crime in her hometown. So we get a sense of what Nancy's like as a sleuth before she moves to LA and starts pursuing the main mystery of the movie. Because not only is she telling these criminals, if you submit a plea deal and go to therapy, then your sentence will be less or whatever. She's like, oh, they're cranky. Let me whip out some snacks I have and give them food. She's providing free labor for the police department. We never see her be financially compensated for anything. And when I was doing research about the books, this was something that like comes up, is that she is consistently offered money but doesn't take it, which is another thing about her social class, because also in the book she travels all across the world to solve crimes for people. And then while she's in the middle of solving crime, her kind of boyfriend Ned calls her and is like, I had this dream where you like dumped me for the guy in Smallville and then I turned into a squirrel. What does that mean? And she's like, I can't talk about this right now. Just, yeah, within the first 5 minutes of the movie, it's like bam, 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 bam. Here are all these problems that this girl is solving by herself, and she's doing it with this very chipper, can-do attitude. And isn't Nancy just amazing?
I just wrote Smallville in all caps. It's like, oh, that's bad, but you covered it. And then also, I think it was right away in the beginning, too, where the dad shows up, and he was like, oh, I was in the middle of an eviction case. Like, what?
And I had to leave because you were in danger.
So what happened to the people who were evicted? And that is when I really started thinking about, okay, so everybody is upper middle class, or for some reason doesn't really have to worry about money, and also doesn't give a shit about anyone else. Now I feel like I am reading too far into this.
Well,
but these were the messages we were being sent.
Because part of it too was that I think they technically considered the thing at the beginning a hostage situation. Nancy references that later. In that sense, it would make sense that someone would call him. But yeah, it's still like they were intentional about being like he was defending a case for someone who's about to be evicted from their home and had to leave.
He was very nonchalant about it. I was in the middle of a case.
Yeah, and he's like, the judge was not happy. And I'm just like... Seems like an asshole then. I don't know what to say.
Even when they get to LA, this bothered me too. They get there and she's talking to the realtor as if she signed the paperwork to rent the home. The dad didn't really seem to have a lot of information about the home itself. And I understand he was letting her make this decision, but it feels to me that a lot of men in this movie are, quote unquote, letting Nancy Drew make decisions, but really it's just her doing the emotional and actual labor of organizing their lives.
It's played off like, oh yeah, it sucks that you have to move across the country and start this new school and blah, blah, blah. So as a way to compensate, you can pick our house. Mm-hmm. And this is the part of my brain where it's like, okay, Marin, think about if you're a screenwriter trying to adapt this children's series into something that's going to make girls in 2007 want to go see it. And it's like, oh, mystery with a house, but how do we get them in the house? I understand the leaps that these screenwriters are making to make this happen, which is where I'm like, Marin, maybe you're reading too much into it. But it's awkward writing. We can say that at the very least.
True. But it is for children. But it is still so steeped in patriarchy that it's difficult to stomach. I think that's what it is for me. Yeah. It's okay, it's for children, but it's this steaming hot patriarchal undertones. Yeah.
I'm going to be annoying for a second and reference a class I took when I was in grad school with Maggie, though we did not take this class together. I took a course which was a survey of girls' literature. Shout out Dr. Julie Pfeiffer. You're one of the coolest women I know. So this was books with girl protagonists written for a girl audience, more comparable to middle grade level books than young adult level books. And so during one of our first classes, we discussed how a main fixture in the girls' book, going all the way back to these classics like Little Women to stuff that's being published now, is the main protagonist's capacity for change. So part of her journey is that she needs to change, whether that is by maturing emotionally or intellectually or broadening her worldview, or in the case of some books, it's about her becoming more demure and accommodating. However, my professor pointed out that there are some deviations from this model wherein the protagonist starts the book, quote unquote, perfect, and undergoes no change because the text has already established her as perfect. And in many cases, there's also a connection between this perfection, higher social class, and whiteness, which we can maybe get into later. And so when discussing this model of perfect girl protagonist, my professor referenced the Nancy Drew books.
Okay.
We did not read any Nancy Drew books for that class, so we didn't discuss this idea further in relation to those books. But I held her argument in my mind as I rewatched this movie, because this was my first time watching this movie since taking that class. And I think ultimately this movie adheres to that perfection model in a way I find fruitless and frustrating, because I don't think when you take this movie as a whole that Nancy internally as a character undergoes any growth. And I find that incredibly frustrating. So what are your, because I have my own kind of examples or whatever, but before I dive into those, what are your thoughts to that?
I was thinking that the easiest way, the kind of growth that I expected to see from Nancy Drew, because now that you've articulated it in this way, I understand what I was waiting for.
Okay.
While I was watching it, it was the growth. That didn't happen.
Yeah.
And the little bit of growth I thought would happen is that in the end, she would tell Ned to fuck off. I hated him. I literally wrote,
oh my God,
I hate that skeezy little blonde boy. Like right away in the beginning.
Oh shit, okay, because the person I hate is Corky.
Well, he's terrible too.
Because I was putting all my hater eggs in Corky's basket, so this is gonna be great. Okay.
But Ned is already showing signs of possessiveness. They weren't even together.
Right.
They weren't even together. So if she did want to hook up with someone from Smallville, she could do that if she wanted to. He has no ownership over her. She's an autonomous human being. I just thought that would happen. I was surprised by the absence of it.
Interesting. Because this movie sets up this fish out of water narrative too. Nancy is this small town girl who she has been taken out of her home environment where she's considered this wonderkind girl detective. And she's been placed in the city of LA where there's millions of people and she's just one random person, and she doesn't know anyone. And so that story model, it's already there, that there are ways for her to grow. But they just don't take advantage of that ever. When she first starts at her new school in LA, there's this montage of her going throughout her day and just being amazing at everything. They're running laps on the track and gym class, and she's way ahead of everyone else. When she's in shop class, she builds this giant castle with 12 buttresses or whatever. She answers all the questions in the math class. And it's like, see, here are all these things that Nancy is so good at. When it comes to the mystery of the movie, she never stumbles onto any red herrings, really, that I can remember. She never actually experiences any setback within her trying to solve this mystery that would spur some kind of moment of growth. The one sort of struggle they give her in the movie is that her dad tells her she's not allowed to sleuth in LA, but she keeps sleuthing anyways. That struggle practically feels non-existent because she just sleuths the entire time. There's 2 times when Ned is like, "Aren't you not supposed to be sleuthing?" And she's like, "I can't stop." And that's it. If you showed us her trying to not sleuth and she develops these other interests and then has an identity crisis that's like, oh wait, maybe I don't actually want to be a sleuth anymore. Then who am I if I'm not a sleuth? That would be so much more interesting. We don't ever see her struggle with homesickness. I'm just listing things that if I were rewriting this movie, this is what I would change. And what else? Another part of the movie is that she's bullied by these 2 girls at school. She seems relatively unfazed by them the entire movie. Her self-esteem maybe there's a couple moments where it's lightly bruised, but after they're mean to her, she still invites them to her birthday party. She starts the movie as this genius, prodigy, confident detective, and that's how the movie ends. She's still a genius, confident, prodigy detective. She is good at everything and she is capable of everything, and it just reaches a point where so much is piled onto her character that it's just more about what she does than who she is. I don't know who she is outside of she's a sleuth who's good also at everything else she tries to do. And I find it frustrating. And as a kid, I obviously did not think about any of these things because I was like, oh, she's a sleuth. That's so cool. But now as an adult, I'm just realizing that I could have been receiving when I was younger a much richer character than I was given.
It's the women can have it all fallacy, really what she's chasing. There was this moment where she's reading a book before bed and it's like how to build sandcastles.
It's advanced sandcastle making, which did make me laugh. I was like, that's a good, because her whole thing is like, I'm going to try to be a normal teenage girl. And she reads that. I was like, okay, that's kind of funny.
But what does she enjoy doing? She likes to sleuth, but that's free labor. What does she like to do? We don't know. And we know that she has morals, right? We know that she empathizes with the thieves, for example, has an understanding of ethics.
Right.
But her ethics are never called into question. She never calls the world into question in any way. She solves this mystery, but at no point does she really stop to consider the violence of it.
No, she doesn't.
And neither does anyone else.
No. And that's what the movie's hinting at with like them moving to LA at the beginning and using that as a narrative device is like LA is a dangerous city. It is unlike an environment you have ever been in. It is dangerous for you to be going off on your own and sticking your nose in people's business or whatever. Warranted anywhere can be a dangerous place. Obviously, there's plenty of danger in River Heights if Nancy is being held hostage in a church by these 2 men at the very beginning. But the movie doesn't ever seem intent on actually commenting on that danger, specifically an adolescent girl's place in that danger.
And that is noticeable.
Yeah.
Very.
One of the other headings I have on my notes is anything insightful this movie has to say about the dangers of girlhood/womanhood feels accidental. For example, the murder that Nancy is solving, it is about this woman who was murdered by a man trying to control her life. And when she told him he couldn't control her life anymore, he killed her. So it's like, oh, okay, this is like patriarchal desire to control women, and when you can't do that, you inflict violence on them. But I don't think the movie is actually aware that's what this murder is about.
I don't think that it is. I mean, sometimes I want to think that it is, especially with how it ends, where Rachel Lee Cook's character, she's a single mom, and we don't really get to know a lot of her story, but we know at one point social services takes her child, and then Nancy Drew's dad helps her get the child back.
Right.
And then she ends up inheriting the mansion. They're able to prove that she's the daughter of this famous
actress.
And she opens a home for other women who need a place to stay, like a women's shelter, more or less.
Yeah.
But nobody talks about it. It's just this expectation like, oh, well, these are the ethics that we uphold. But how did you get there? Who taught you this, Nancy Drew? Her dad is an attorney. Are we meant to believe that because he's an attorney, he has this legal understanding of morality and she just, through osmosis... Anyway, that goes back to her not growing.
Right.
She just came out the womb a perfect person.
Well, that's another missed opportunity, is that Nancy, like so many girl protagonists in girls' books, doesn't have a mom. Her mom died when she was like 3, so she doesn't really remember her mom. And so this murder that she's trying to solve, it has this element of a mother-daughter relationship to it, in that Delia, the murdered actress, gave birth to this baby, put the baby up for adoption, and then she died. And Nancy finds this long-lost daughter and rocks her world by being like, oh, your mom was this murdered movie star. Which Jane, the daughter, she did know she was adopted, but she didn't know who her biological mother was. And Nancy and Jane have one conversation about growing up without moms. And it's just one line, because Jane's like, I don't think you understand what it's like to grow up without a mom. And Nancy's like, actually, I do. Wouldn't it have been so much more interesting if instead of fucking this love triangle with Ned and Corky, we got like this teenager really dealing with perhaps like unresolved grief about her mother who she didn't know, that was prompted by this case that has this element of motherhood to it. I'm not saying that I'm a screenwriter, because I'm not, but so many of the choices that this movie makes are just the most simplistic, lazy choices that it's really easy to be like, oh, here's how you could have done this better, or here's how you could have scrapped that and done this instead.
She's given no depth. It's just a girlhood narrative or a womanhood narrative. And the movies that I was thinking of adjacent to Nancy Drew, the Barbie movie, right, where she's leaving this world to go to this world where things are dangerous, but she grows, something happens, she changes, she's changed by this world, she allows this world to change her. And then also Legally Blonde, where she goes to this world, that world changes her, and they're both perfect women who get to experience imperfection. And they grow into that imperfection and from that imperfection. But instead, Nancy Drew somehow just keeps getting better and better at everything.
Nancy has 2 separate lines where she references past cases. First, she says, usually when someone tries to kill me, it's because I'm onto something. And then later she says the line, it really gets my goat when someone tries to kill me. It's so rude. Both those things imply that people have tried to kill her before, right? But we're not talking about that. And with that second line, it really gets my goat when someone tries to kill me. It's so rude. Like, we're supposed to think it's charming that she remains so level-headed and polite. Because when she says that line, it's after she's found a bomb in her car, that someone's going to blow up her car while she was driving it. And she manages to find the bomb and she throws it into a like manhole or something, which I'm like, Nancy, are there people down there? Like, what? And miraculously no one is hurt. And the bomb goes off and she falls and it's slow motion and fucking Ned is there. So the movie knows that what she's doing is dangerous. But is there a way to make a fun movie for girls that also appropriately addresses the danger? A fun movie of this kind involving a girl detective that also addresses the dangers of existing in that world as that girl detective. Is it even possible?
I think it is, because I think it has to be, because what I'm thinking now, hearing you relay this very ridiculous scenario, how, she knows that the world is violent, but it's sterilized with her via her appearance.
Right.
And the expectations that she just continues on with her day because she's this perfect person. Girls we know that the world is violent. We know that the world hates us. We maybe don't understand why.
Right.
We don't know the intricacies of misogyny and the overarching principles that have put it into place. But we already know that violence exists. So how could we not talk about it? I think it's harder to not. And when you don't talk about it, this is what happens. It's a movie like this. I am drawing a parallel here that I don't know if I agree with necessarily, but it's coming to mind, so I'm going to say it. A part of it feels like when people ask the question, should we talk to children about racism? And it's like, children already know racism.
Yeah. They're learning
exists. They're already learning it because it's taught to them. So we need to talk about it. And I think that misogyny and sexism are the same way. They already know these things exist. They've already learned them. And not talking about it is just going to make it so that what they do understand is what the world tells them. And not what people who love and care about them understand about it and how it's going to impact them and what they can do to live a better life.
I agree with that. Even at the beginning when Nancy's dad is like, I don't want you sleuthing in LA. LA is a much more dangerous city than River Heights. Even that could have been like an opportunity for him to be like, the way you exist in the world is different than the way I exist in the world. Because the one scene in this movie that I still find actually quite effective is when Nancy realizes who murdered Delia. Because she and her dad are in the car with Dashiell Biedermeier, the man who killed her. And this is after she's found Delia's will. The lawyer guy, he asks her if she has the will. And the way he says it, it's creepy. And she immediately knows, like, oh, fuck, this is the guy who killed her. And she tells her dad, we need to get out of this car. And the way that this murderer is looking at her and the way she looks so afraid. It's one time in the movie she feels actually afraid. And she's operating on like pure instinct of being like, Dad, we need to get out of this car, like right now. But then, so Nancy like flings her body out of the car, leaves her dad in the car. It's like, bye, Dad. Which like, honestly, I get it. You know, save yourself. You're the one that he wants to kill. And she goes on this chase and she's trying to get away from this killer and then these other men that he has sent after her who have been terrorizing her the whole movie, who at one point had kidnapped her earlier. That scene, I feel her fear so much and so deeply. And I know this movie's PG or whatever, but this is the stakes I wanted more of throughout it. But then once she's trapped by these 3 or 4 different men trying to kill her, she's bantering with them. And this is not me victim blaming Nancy. This is me pointing out the stupidity of the way the scene is written. They have guns to kill her. One of them like cracks his knuckles like he's going to strangle her. And she's like, if you strangle me like that, you're going to leave fingerprints because you're not wearing gloves. And if you shoot me, it's just going to be really messy and they're going to know that it was you. And she's explaining all the ways that they won't be able to get away with killing her. And I'm like, why are you having her banter with these men that want to kill her? It's not a detriment to her character if right now she is scared and just freaking the fuck out. I've never been in that situation, so however you react is how you're going to react. But as I was watching it, it struck me as incredibly stupid. Especially because 5 minutes earlier, the movie had actually done a decent job of establishing her fear.
Again, I feel like because it is for children, though, maybe it's even more important that they get shit right. Because it's normalizing and humorizing, if that's a word, violence against women is really what is happening. What a great example of how insidious that really is. That phenomenon of talking so nonchalantly about dead women. Murdered women, I should say.
The way that scene ends is that the caretaker of the house, he could tell there was commotion happening or something, so he storms in and whacks all the bad guys on the head with the shovel. And in fact, he saves her. And I'm sure there's some person out there who's like, it's so annoying that she doesn't save herself. But I'm like, she's a 16-year-old girl. She's a child. We should expect adults to protect children and to save children from danger.
She's being put in danger by men, by the violence of men. And then the men around her are often too stupid, like her own father, to realize that she's in danger or to take action. They're like, oh, she just likes to sleuth. The reason they wanted her to stop sleuthing is because it was dangerous.
Right. But her dad is hardly around. She just tells him she stopped sleuthing and he believes her. And if this is a rule that you have put in place, then warranted, I'm not a parent, so I don't know what it's like to parent a teenager, but shouldn't you have some system in place to ensure that your child is following the rules you have set?
Don't go doing free labor for law enforcement. You wouldn't catch my fucking kid doing that. Absolutely not. That would be the real problem, right? But it can be almost impossible to make sure teenagers are following the rules that you set forth for them.
And that's part of being a teenager, is testing authority. And
but even the way she tests authority is perfect.
Right, because at the end of the movie, when her dad finds out that she was sleuthing, he tells her, I realize how hard it must have been for you to do the right thing because you're helping people, which, like, she is. Mm-hmm. So you're exactly right in that she is the most exceptional girl ever, that even when she is doing, quote unquote, the wrong thing, it's actually the right thing.
What an impossible set of standards to live up to. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time since I read a book written for young adults. I don't read a lot of YA stuff. I read this really beautifully written memoir called Tasting the Sky by Ibtisam Barakat. Tasting the Sky, A Palestinian Childhood. And I liked it in part because this also came out in 2007. So same year as the movie. Our writer is literally just telling the story about her life, her childhood growing up in Palestine. And it is the resiliency and the layers and levels of grief and violence that she has had to, her and her family and her entire country have had to survive is difficult. It's not unimaginable because it's happening. Mm-hmm. I can imagine it. We can see it. It's happening in the palm of our hands to this day. She opens the book to her experience when she's probably around Nancy Drew's age. And it's 1981, and she's stopped at an Israeli checkpoint just moving from one city to the other city. And she gets stopped. They pull everyone off of the bus. The soldiers do. The reason that she is traveling between cities is because her brother had a P.O. box that he let her keep. So she has a P.O. box where she sends and receives letters from people all over the world. Oh, wow. So this is 1981, right? And it's in occupied territories. Mm-hmm. So having access to the world is difficult. She stays in contact with people from all over the world in this way. And it's not an exaggeration to say she's risking her life to travel back and forth to check her P.O. box for letters, just to learn about the world and to share her story with other people. Mm-hmm. That got me thinking about movement, the way that we move through the world. These are very disjointed thoughts, but I think in a very nonlinear way. I write in a very nonlinear way.
That makes sense to me so far.
So it got me thinking about movement and the risks that we take to grow and to change. Mm-hmm. And while Nancy Drew technically is taking risks, she's taking them for what? Because it's quote unquote the right thing, but no one's ever told her that. So the risks don't feel real. Technically her life is at stake, but the movie never treats it as if her life is really at stake. And so this idea of movement, I just kept thinking about that. And then I kept thinking about how many times they say sleuthing in this movie. It became like an anaphora. If it was a poem, this is like a refrain. This is sleuthing. I won't sleuth anymore. This is a word, and it's an odd word, which I looked up, by the way. Okay. Late 12th century, coming from the word sloth, which means to track or trail of a person or beast. From Old Norse, slew, trail or track, as of a person in snow. A word of uncertain origin. So let me they can trace it so far. Mm-hmm. So at some point, the word tracing sleuth
is untraceable.
It has an uncertain origin. And then the meaning detective is attested by 1872, a shortening of sleuth hound, keen investigator, a figurative use of that word, which is attested from late 14th century as a bloodhound. So this idea of a tracking dog almost. That then got me thinking about language, right? All these things are swirling around in my brain, like sleuthing and language. And then there's this really beautiful paragraph where Barakat talks about a specific word in Arabic. I'm actually just going to read it. She's talking about her pen pals. That's how she starts this. I have many pen pals, tourists, Holy Land pilgrims, and students who join pen pal programs to see the world through other people's words. Some write only once in a long while. Others write often. But all of them send me scraps of their lives translated into English, which I have been studying for 6 years ever since I turned 11. In return, I tell my pen pals about my school, friends, teachers, studies. I describe the seasons, the lamb, the wheat and olive harvest, and the Eid celebrations. Looking into a hand mirror, I describe myself if I don't have a picture to send. Translating many words and sentences, I also write about the Arabic language. I explain that verbs in Arabic form roots that create trees of nouns and word structures. And then she goes on to, there's a root verb, kataba. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. It's Kataba. She walks us through words. That root verb makes up words that mean to write, a written letter, a female writer, a typewriter, a book, and a desk for writing, and a library. They all come from the same verb.
That's so cool.
It's really beautiful. And that also made me think about how, and I know that this is written down somewhere. I don't know where. I was talking to TJ about it, my lover, my legally wed lover. He has more of a background in linguistics, like sociolinguistics. And so I know he was telling me it is written down in some way, but from a more scientific point of view. But growing up as a writer, listening to other writers, reading a lot of poetry, at some point, somebody, if they haven't said it to you yet, if you're a poet, someone's going to tell you somewhere along the way that, or any kind of writer really, is that what makes a quote unquote good, or what makes a kind of interesting text, are the verbs. You don't just sit down. How do you sit? You have to constantly describe how someone is doing something, how you've done something. It's in the movement that we find the poetry. It's in the movement that we are able to distinguish these really tiny discrepancies between our facial expressions, between how we're responding to our environment. So I just thought that was so beautiful. An entire language built on the same principles as poetry. And because what I've been watching and consuming lately is related to the genocide that's happening in the palms of our hands, I've been hearing a lot of Arabic, and I've never really heard it, at least at the rate that I'm hearing it now. And I kept thinking, wow, this language is so poetic, just seeing the translations of it. You can see translation like on Instagram posts. Like you can see the poetry in it. But yeah, knowing that the language is built off of verbs, is built in the same way a poem is, makes so much sense. The entire language is a poem. So that's where Nancy Drew led me.
That's awesome. Don't undersell your non-linear way of thinking, because the whole beautiful mini lecture that you just gave, it's like highlighting, because I don't know if you said this memoir that you're quoting from and talking about is a young adult memoir. So this book is an example of taking so many rich ideas about belonging and identity and language and danger, and the danger we are willing to put ourselves in for the sake of something else. It's all here in this book, and I have not read this book, but it seems like it's done pretty successfully and artfully, and it's for an audience not dissimilar to the audience of this Nancy Drew movie. So there is a way to make it happen, make it work. And it just makes me sadder that Nancy Drew was not up to the task. And as you were describing the way this author talks about moving through the world. I have to say that, yes, the way Nancy exists in the world is dangerous because she is a young girl in this patriarchal world. But so much of her ability to move into the world, it is innately connected to her social class and to her race. And it's really clear to me now, especially as an adult. I just felt the need to acknowledge that. And you comparing the way Nancy is able to move through the world versus, say, a Palestinian girl is. It's just very different. I feel like this is a major swerve, but I need to rant about Corky. I know we're literally being very serious talking about genocide and poetry and whatnot, but I do need to rant about Corky, if I may. Aside from all the stuff we talked about with how this movie talks about danger and violence against women, I think the thing that frustrated me the most is that we place Nancy in this new environment and she doesn't get to really have a substantial relationship with another girl. In the Nancy Drew books, Nancy has two best friends who are also girls. Their names are George and Bess. And they help her with a lot of her cases. They are very prominent in the action of the story. They have one scene at the very beginning of the movie when Nancy is still in her hometown. And they make fun of Ned in a way. And I was like, these girls seem great. They're in one scene, we never see them again. And so then Nancy moves to LA temporarily. She never mentions how much she misses these friends ever again. We never see her talking to them on the phone. And so instead of having her develop a friendship with other girls, this movie tortures Nancy. And speaking of the importance of verbs, I was very deliberate with choosing the word tortures because I do think it's torturing her. By having her only friend be a 12-year-old boy who his first interaction with her is catcalling her in the cafeteria. And he clearly hits on her. He has a crush on her. And he's 12. It's established that he's 12. And she is 16 and he has a crush on her. And it's not abnormal for a 12-year-old to have a crush on someone who's older. But Nancy's clearly not interested in him. I will say that she never once shows interest in him. He literally tells her she's not like other girls. She looks really uncomfortable when he says that. I don't think she wants to be perceived as better than other people because she's quote unquote different than them. But I'm just like, why? If this movie opted to not focus on the Ned and Corky of it all, there are so many ways we could have had Nancy undergo internal growth.
I also want to point out, though, about him, he at one point pretends to be choking.
Oh, yeah.
Which, okay, if someone's choking, you shouldn't give them CPR. Which is what,
you give them the Heimlich.
And she's about to breathe into his mouth. Yeah, he's pretending to choke. And she's like, I am medically trained. And then towards the end, also at a party, she gives someone a tracheotomy. He's gone into anaphylactic shock. And I don't know, based on her giving CPR to somebody who needed the Heimlich, I'm not a medical professional. But I don't want Nancy Drew performing any kind of medical intervention on me. But yeah, that is manipulative and assaultive behavior.
The broader context for that is that Corky's older sister, who also goes to school with Nancy, is this girl named Inga, and Inga's friend is Trish, and they're the two girls that bully Nancy. They overhear Nancy telling the principal that she's trained in CPR, and so they devise this whole plan where we're gonna have Corky pretend to choke at the basketball game when the whole school is there, and Nancy's gonna give him mouth to mouth, and then he's gonna kiss her. And if you've seen The Sandlot, it's just when Squints pretends to drown so he can kiss Wendy Peppercorn. It's the exact same thing. It's the whole thing to oh, let's force this boy to kiss her so she's embarrassed. It is assaultive behavior. And that's the one person the movie decides to let her be friends with, aside from Ned.
Which, fuck Ned, honestly. I'm sorry. Don't like him. That seems to be a thing. To not let women have true friendship and to make us believe that people being mean to us, we should just forgive them and they're still our friends.
This is a part of the movie that feels especially of its time. When I revisit a lot of films and TV from early 2000s, it's just rampant. Where all female characters must hate each other and/or be in competition for a boy. And that's why they hate each other, but they can't just be friends.
Right.
The end of these two girls spend most of the movie being pretty mean to Nancy. And Nancy has remained very nice to them throughout. She invites them to her birthday party. One of them starts acting like Nancy's friend because she sees Ned and is like, oh, he's cute. I want to date him. Which I'm like, girl, why? Ned is truly the most Wonder Bread of romantic leads ever. They were really just like, it's 10-year-old girls watching this movie. They'll eat whatever, so let's feed them some bland-ass bread.
He was no Casper the fucking ghost.
No, because the last movie we talked about was Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio. The comparison between Leo and then fucking Ned.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff relating to what you were saying about, or what we've both been saying about the way this movie approaches female friendship or the lack thereof, is why I want to read you in what I have deemed an incorrect logline. Okay. If you're ready. And now even rereading this, there's things in here that we've already talked about. So this is just going to activate us all over again. And this is from the Warner Brothers website. Warner Brothers distributed this movie. So this was the official write-up that their marketing team came up with to describe this movie. With her magnifying glass and fingerprint powder in hand, Nancy Drew leaves River Heights for La La Land. I hate how that rhymes. It's not poetry. She's out to solve one of the greatest mysteries ever, the death of movie star Delia Draycott. But the bigger mystery is how our perky, plaid-clad sleuth will fit in with the text messaging teen queens of mean she meets at Hollywood High. The face Maggie is making right now, and I'm not even done yet. Join Nancy as she finds danger, mystery, adventure, romance, the coolest fashion, and the hottest LA scenes. Because wherever Nancy goes, excitement still follows.
What? Okay, it's literally called Nancy Drew. She's a fucking sleuth. That's the point of the entire series. And did that just say that what's really going to interest you is how mean the other girls are?
Yeah. Is how will she fit in with the text messaging teen queens of mean she meets at Hollywood High?
What the fuck?
Which it is just inaccurate because that's hardly part of the plot at all.
Yeah.
But it provides another version of what this movie could have been. Her dad tells her she's not allowed to sleuth anymore. So she's like, I'm going to try really hard to make connections with new people at this school. And she tries, and it's really hard. And she has to deal with what is it like to be bullied? Or maybe conversely, she hits it off great with some other girls and is like, oh, maybe this is the kind of life I want. Maybe I don't want to be a sleuth anymore. And then she has to figure out what that means for her future and her sense of self. But instead, it's just like, oh no, they're just one-dimensional villains who make fun of her clothes. But then suddenly at the end, we're supposed to think they're friends?
It's not believable. Also, I don't know, the mention about the fashion doesn't really have a lot to do with it. They make fun of her outfits, the Mean Girls do. I don't know, the whole thing seems wrong.
And then the part where I was like scanning it before reading out loud, where I was like, oh, that's fascinating, is that the last sentence, join Nancy as she finds danger, mystery, adventure, romance, the coolest fashion, blah, blah, blah. But they're highlighting the danger first in that list. So again, they know it's there, but they're not saying anything insightful about it.
No. And it would have been so easy to do that. Also, she's so perfect that she sews her own clothes.
Which
all
honestly,
of her outfits she makes on her own.
When I was watching that, I was like, sewing would be a good skill to have that I don't have.
She has all the skills.
Because she even says that when someone's talking to her about her outfit, and she says that she made it from a pattern that belonged to her mom. And it's like, oh, that could be a really poignant detail if you bothered to explore the ways in which she's trying to forge a connection with her dead mother who she doesn't remember.
I'd be curious to know because I did read the Nancy Drew books, but like you mentioned, I don't remember so much of it. I wonder if there are so many little elements that had depth and were contextualized in the books that are just thrown in the movie.
Maybe.
And it's a children's movie, but they will also try to appeal to the adults in a certain generation.
Right.
I would be curious if your mom had read the Nancy Drew books growing up or something, if it would ended up being nostalgic for her because she remembers all these little details. I don't think it makes up for anything. And maybe that isn't the case at all.
I did go down a little rabbit hole.
Okay.
That I didn't put in my notes because I was like, we won't have time to talk about it. But you have provided me with a segue. And I discovered that as Hollins alumni, we have access to JSTOR for free, which is my favorite scholarly database, FYI. And so I was doing a bunch of JSTOR searches for Nancy Drew and pulling a bunch of articles and reading them. And I found one that was published in, I believe it was the 70s. It was old and warranted. The first Nancy Drew books were published in the 30s. So at that point, Nancy Drew was already a very established figure in culture. But this one article I read, the author talked about essentially what we've been talking about, which is that in these books, Nancy is always perfect. Nancy is always capable. Nancy doesn't change. And the crux of every book is solving the mystery. It's not about how do we learn more about people who aren't like us. How do we, I think the phrase the author used, which is very outdated now, was cultivate tolerance for minorities. Which I'm like, it's like very of its time, but I get what she was saying. That like these books are not challenging anyone's worldview. And that plays into Nancy's race, Nancy's social class as well. So I don't know if those kinds of complexities and nuances were present in the books, honestly. I would have to do a lot more research on that. And I'll have to put the like name of that article and the author in the show notes in case people want to look at it. But
in that sense, this is more or less true to the books.
I
there
think
is an
so.
absence of all of those things.
Yeah, because the main criticism was that these are books designed to entertain children, not cultivate their critical thinking skills.
I mean, I'm not asking necessarily for us to have to think critically about.
But it's interesting to think about that argument in relation to this movie, where it's like, this movie entertained the shit out of me when I was like 9 years old. But now that I have cultivated critical thinking skills in other ways, returning to it, I'm like, ooh, this is kind of a shit show.
Well, because what is the value? Well, I think there is value in just being entertained, okay?
There is, absolutely.
But as a kid, you don't necessarily like know what's at stake, though. You don't know what's missing. So it's our responsibility as adults to make sure that it is part of. I get it. If it's a book, it's in book form, at least they're reading. Good. They're learning a skill. But what skill are you learning watching a movie just for entertainment purposes that ignores social class, that ignores questions of violence against the bodies that this movie is being marketed towards, which is young girls. Right? Yeah. I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't really know the answer to that because I still watch Rock of Love for fun. So I'm not saying...
It's...
Anyway, things to think about.
And one final thing to think about is, what does this movie make you want to tell your younger self, Maggie?
Wow. Okay. What would I tell her? I would tell her that, I mean, the obvious is just that you don't have to be perfect. And there was a time in my life when I was striving for that. I mean, if I had seen this movie at maybe 9 or 10 years old, like by the time I was 13 or 14, I was like, I'm gonna burn my fucking bra and shave my head. It changed overnight. It's like I got my period and I was like, I'm gonna bleed over this fucking patriarchy. But not quite that quickly. But it happened. It did feel like it happened overnight. But prior to that, I'm thinking very specifically this movie is marketed to prepubescent Maggie. And I think in general, it's marketed towards like that. Those standards are impossible. Those standards are impossible to live up to. And if I really thought about it, there are other Nancy Drew type characters that had me fucking hating myself. So don't hate yourself.
That's a lot more thoughtful than I think what I'm going to say, because I'm just too exhausted by this movie to be fully earnest right now. I'm just going to say that I would tell my younger self that unnecessary romantic side plots are stupid.
I love that.
And that there are so many more interesting things to do with your time then think you want a boy like Ned Nickerson.
That skeezy little shit. Skeezy little shit bag.
That's what I would tell her.
That's great. That's great advice.
Thank you.
It truly is. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, is it
what's
time?
the segue here. I guess it's time. The movie that we will be watching for next time, that is a surprise to Marin, was written and directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal, and it came out in 2021, and it's called The Lost Daughter.
I have seen this movie.
You have seen it? It's very, very good.
It's so fucking good.
And I really want to talk
this is... I had a conversation with someone about this movie not that long ago. But, yeah, Olivia Colman, Dakota Johnson.
The cast is really great. It's shot beautifully. Everything about it. It's just a really wonderful film. I'm actually excited that you have seen it.
That is not what I was expecting. But just thinking about the way that movie is structured, too, I'm like, oh, okay. Because there's layers to, like, girlhood, daughterhood, motherhood.
I have a list of movies now that I can pick from. This was not what I was planning on. And then I watched Nancy Drew. I think watching Nancy Drew and the absence of the mother character, who obviously was central to her life due to that absence, sort of made me feel like this was more urgent to talk about. And I thought it would be a good follow-up.
I'm excited.
All right.
Hell yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have thoughts on Nancy Drew, whether it's this movie or you read the books or you've seen any of the other myriad of TV adaptations or film adaptations, because there are a lot, email us at tellmeimsorry@gmail.com. Is there anything else we need to say? One day we're going to have an actual outro, but today is not that day.
No, today is not. I also want to talk really briefly again about Ibtisam Barakat's book, Tasting the Sky, Palestinian Childhood. Really great. It's really beautifully written. And also, if you don't know what is happening in Palestine right now, what has been happening for decades and decades, and you're like, I don't know where to start, this book would be a great place to put all of that into context for you. And she also has a reference in the back for what you can read to continue learning.
That's a really good idea. Definitely. All right. I'm Marin.
I'm Maggie.
This is Tell Me I'm Sorry. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great week. Bye. Bye.